Right. So good afternoon for everyone online. It looks like that we have already a great audience joining in. A few people still joining as we go, but let's get started. So fairly briefly, what we're here about today is to discuss about EU Pay Transparency Directive. And how we are calling this and labeling this is that laying the foundations thereof. And in particular, in this webcast, we're discussing about job architecture and job evaluation as a vital building blocks thereof. So with that, let's get started. And we're building this as a series, a mini-series, if you will, of 3 sessions. So in the first one, we're discussing about laying the foundations of jobs and their leveling, which is essential for pay transparency. In the following session, our professionals will explain how the pay gaps are identified and closed as per the new legislation demands. And in the webinar final series, there's a session on reward ecosystems for sustainable pay transparency practices. So hopefully you will be capable of joining us on all 3 of them. Thank you. So as briefly covered, and I'm not going to repeat myself, but series of 3, so laying the foundations, then understanding the gap, how do we bridge the gap, and then how do we design the reward ecosystem going forward from there. So that's the flow. As of today, what we are packaged in here, and we're imagining this to be around about 45 minutes, will be a quick introduction of our specialists on here online. Then we will be discussing about job architecture as a foundational element. Some will be covering that piece. And then we will be discussing about how do you actually evaluate the work of equal value? How do you go about it? And then a bit about covering the job leveling systems and the complexities thereof. This will be covered by Francis, and then we briefly wrap it up and discuss about how do we go forward from here. So in terms of introductions, warmly welcome on my behalf, Janne Elava, Director in the Human Capital Practice at Deloitte in the Nordics. And with me in the studio, I have Samu Eskola.
Yes, nice to meet you, everyone, and nice to see you. So many of you are online. Samu Eskola here, manager in the Human Capital Practice here in Helsinki as well, and been focusing on HR transformations, but also workforce transformation topics, which we are covering today. Yeah.
Perfect. And then we have Francis joining us from Belgium. So Francis, would you like to introduce yourself as well?
Yes, thanks, Jan and Samu. My name is Francis, director with a total rewards background, so assisting clients from a broad total rewards perspective, really from strategy up to design into implementation, and doing quite a lot of work on everything related to pay equity and transparency, and working closely together with Janne and Samu on this topic. Nice to meet you.
Perfect, thank you. So without further ado, Samuel, I'll hand it over to you.
Yes, thank you, Janne. So let's first focus on the job architecture topic that is something that I've been working with our clients with, and we have a couple interesting point of views here that we want to share with you that are critical going forward on the topics that then Francis will take forward. So job architecture, here is our kind of broad overview on the topic. And we want to kind of focus and also highlight here in the beginning that the solid job architecture is vital for many reasons. Today we'll be focusing on rewarding side of it, of course. That's the key today and in our webinar series. But there are many also other dimensions, as you can see on green on the slide, that are also important elements and purposes for job architecture. And it's important to link these through, and you kind of understand that this is the broader picture, and you need to take into account the broader picture there. Maybe elements that for many in our audience are kind of familiar stuff already, but also maybe something that is not in place yet, so not necessarily at the moment in the job architecture or considered in this way that we kind of see it. So there might be those dimensions as well. On the gray kind of text boxes there, we have some of the key elements that I want to highlight. So of course, job architecture in this case, what we talk about here and see essential is that it creates the consistent framework for understanding the jobs across the organization. That's the kind of baseline for also pay transparency and equal pay from those perspectives. Then providing also the common platform to align human capital processes. So also it's not only about rewarding processes, but also linking to those to the other dimensions of the job architecture and understanding that how do those link to each other. Supporting the career mobility, one element there, promote trust in the underlying process and systems. So of course, when we talk about pay transparency, trust is in key role there. So also job architecture plays a key role here, being also at least somewhat usually transparent to the employees as well and to the full organization, depending on how the organization has set it up currently. But yeah, those are some of the elements. Also, common language mentioned there, and supporting the internal equity. So of course, those are some of the elements we always keep kind of as a kind of principles going forward when we are designing a job architecture or renewing it. Yes, and kind of now digging deeper to the kind of rewarding side of it. Firstly, a little bit, I mentioned the common language. I want to still kind of emphasize these 4 different elements we have on the slide that are critical when we talk about pay transparency and what links to that topic. So of course titles, titling. So the kind of consistent way of meaningful way of kind of creating the titling in the organization, reflecting at the accurate level and work to be described. But also the levels then there. So that's something that we will be focusing today, as well as the grades there. So of course, levels talking about the different organizational levels where we can assign also the jobs then to creating that criteria. And grades are linked often to the kind of levels in a sense that where we kind of then identify the pay grades, so to say, to the work, the jobs themselves. So that's another element that we'll be looking at here, and then the career path. So how do those come together in terms of function-based job families and jobs, and in that sense also the career paths we can provide in our organization. So those are the key elements we'll be talking about, and then of course as shown in the side, then identifying and assessing the work of equal value through the appropriate cohorts. That's what Francis will be then talking about, where we link these different elements together. One also dimension there as a kind of a last point on the grade there is the communication and change. One of the elements that we work with our organizations is also the governance model. How do you govern this, and how do you keep up and keep it alive, the job architecture, in a sense that it's up to date always. So that's one of the challenges. Often the job architecture might be quite heavy in the organization. So how do you then make sure that it's always kind of then up to date and reflecting the changes you have in the workplace and work. Yeah. Good. Then going forward, we have our global job architecture practices survey results here on the screen. So we have this yearly study we do throughout the globe with organizations, and last year we conducted it with plus 600 respondents. Organizations sharing their current state of their job architecture practices. And something kind of, there are good points that we found through the survey that we wanted to share here also in the beginning of the webinar with you. And a couple of kind of starting points here we see on the slide. So the elements that organizations usually have in their job architecture, we have job titling, leveling, pay structures, ranges, and grades, and also the functions and families. So those are the 4 elements that usually organizations have there in place, and that's great to hear, especially when we're talking about pay transparency, that we have those structures in place, because those are key. But then we see that not that many organizations have career pathing or that governance model that I mentioned just there in place. So those are some elements that we see that organizations are building up currently, but still evolving there, as well as the skills framework. So many talk about also kind of skills catalogs nowadays as well, bringing that fluid maybe perspective to their linking that to their job architecture. But that's also something that is still fairly new for many organizations. Yeah.
Anything, some of that strikes odd for you on those ones, because I'm kind of a bit picking on those career pathing, bit there 47, the skills framework 28. Is this something that you see in your work as well?
Yeah, it's something that when we talk about job architecture with our clients and organizations, they often seeing this as a kind of a huge kind of potential dimension to bring in and infuse into the job architecture. And what we see there is that some organizations like rather take small steps there going forward to kind of infuse some elements of the skills framework into their job architecture, and that's something that usually kind of quite well works with some of the organizations. So to kind of then to go that kind of skills-based organization direction in sense. Yeah.
Exactly. Yes.
Yeah. And 23% of organizations state that they are not agile really with their job architecture practices, but rather tend to build it and kind of not update it much after that. So that's of course one of the pain points why also organizations come to us to discuss about job architecture. So how to really keep up with the changes in the organization, especially today when we talk about pay transparency and related processes. It's key that you have up-to-date job architecture in place. Yeah. And then as kind of last point on this slide, we have the business drivers, key business drivers for job architecture. Four elements. So the structure in a sense for jobs to have that kind of alignment across the jobs, but also career pathing and talent development mentioned there, pay programs, assessments, alignments, and lastly, having the minimal structure in place. So that's the least kind of popular options of these four we have on the slide. But I think it would be great to also hear what does our audience think about the business drivers you have for your job architecture. And we have a couple of poll questions to you. First one about these drivers. So please pick and choose from the screen. Which are the drivers for your job architecture in business, kind of in business sense? What is driving your job architecture development? Let's give a moment for audience to.
And we're looking at single choice, right?
Yeah, yes. Exactly. So you can pick the one option, I think. We got already answers here. Clearly, there are two drivers that are most popular for our audience. So job structure practices. So that the first one for also based on our survey, and then the third point there as the next one. So pay, program, assessments, and alignments, as we're gonna talk about today as well. More about that.
Yes.
And then also the career pathing and talent development mentioned there, but no other drivers in a sense. So those are also popular among our audience. Yeah. Great to see. Thanks for the answers, and we will have a couple of polls coming up later as well. But then moving on to even closer to the topic of today that Francis will be talking about. Let's move on here. Yes, on the next slide. So job leveling and evaluation, how did organizations see that? This is, I think, also very interesting to see kind of how organizations approach the topic. And there are differences that we can see. Here, I also want to highlight that it's a global survey we have.
Precisely.
So for instance, in the US, we see that organizations use job architecture a bit differently than we use it in Europe. And we have, of course, now, for instance, this legislation that is coming in that impacts also the use of job architecture in future in organizations. That's all visible, for instance, maybe in the first question. So does your organization use job leveling guides? Most organizations do, but there are some organizations that don't. But we see that there's also a difference that it is becoming definitely more popular when such needs to pay transparency, for instance, coming. Then we have also statements to describe what are describing best the use of job leveling and evaluation in organizations. And most of the organizations have enterprise-wide approach to job leveling, but there are also some variability based on functions and geographies that we can see, as some of the respondents see here. Some organizations don't yet have formal approach to job leveling, or it's highly variable. So we do see a lot of kind of changes here across the organizations. Then a little bit more about the job leveling and evaluation practices. So how do organizations then kind of evaluate and do job leveling in their organizations? So usually job levels are tied to base pay ranges, something that is also advisable when it comes to pay transparency, that you have also the linkage to the pay element there, definitely. Then secondly, annual incentives, which makes sense, often visible at organizations. Also, then job leveling guidelines that describe the requirements to entry level, and so looking at the leveling there, and then thirdly, long-term incentives as well as one of the linkages there. Little bit less linkages to information access or training and talent development opportunities, or then there's the health and well-being related then benefits maybe as well. So that's also, I think, interesting here to see.
Absolutely, yes.
Yeah. And a little bit more kind of as I think maybe my last slide on the survey results we have here. So talking about the methodology that organizations usually use for job leveling and evaluation. So primarily, we see that there is market pricing and survey benchmarking as a kind of a assessment methodology there in place for organizations. Then secondly, primarily point factor based then methodology, and then some others, so combination of market pricing and point factor. And here also we see a shift to the future in a sense that this is quite much like externally driven, market pay driven exercise until now with organizations. But now we see that the pay transparency coming in, we see that the internal factors are also driving in the future this methodology as a kind of use. So that's what we see coming up there definitely.
And then maybe just to add, Samu,
yeah.
I think, and you already referred to it, this was a global survey, so also including a lot of US companies as well. So it's both EU as US. And you clearly see there a difference. If you look at the US, it's primarily market-driven, benchmark-driven, job code-driven. While if you look at the EU, we see that a lot more companies are also looking at a point factor-based evaluation system or more looking at the internal equity. So you see, if we don't have the time today to really go into the details of these results, but we see really a difference in the way companies are approaching this from a US versus an EU perspective, where the US is by far more external benchmark driven if you compare that with the EU. Just wanted to add that to put that into perspective.
Yes.
Perfect. Thank you.
Exactly. That's definitely a key point, and I think it's very much reflected in these answers one can see on the screen. Yeah, and then as a kind of last, maybe I think finding from the survey, what kind of point factor methodology are you using? Was asked from the organizations, and most of them use off-the-shelf solution from a major provider consultancy. So of course there are many big players there in the market, and also there's Deloitte's solution there that is in this category. But then also many do use this kind of methodology that is from a major provider, but customized to the needs of the organization, whether it's about the grades or how they are used. So that's I think interesting to see as well. Whereas then it's kind of a rare case to have an in-house solution which is developed internally. So I think this is also interesting to see, and also linking to what Francis will be soon talking about, these different methodologies and kind of drivers to those different methodologies used. But here we have also one question to the audience, actually, that is usually interesting point and differs between different organizations when it comes to job architecture and grading system, how transparent it is to employees. So our question is, how transparent is your job architecture and grading system among employees? Fully transparent or somewhat transparent or not transparent at all, only used internally by HR are our options. So really interesting to see how our audience sees this in their organization. Many answers coming in already quickly. So definitely what I was maybe expecting is that it is somewhat transparent.
Exactly.
Then scope. So whether it's job architecture or the grading system, the grades people are assigned to, the jobs that are assigned to. So these are the factors that usually a little bit depend on the organization. Some say that they are fully transparent with this system, and for some organizations it is definitely so that it's not transparent, but mainly used by HR. Yeah, super interesting to see as well this one. Yeah, thanks once again for the responses. Next we'll move on to the actual then next steps on transparency, pay transparency topics, and looking at the category of workers, evaluating the work of equal value. And Francis.
Yes, thank you, Sami, for the introduction on the job architecture survey and then the insightful results of our survey. And I think as a starter, and let's immediately move to the next slide. I think I just wanted to have a quick recap on the EU Pay Transparency Directive and the importance of the notion category of workers. I think we're not going to talk you through the entire directive and the scope of the directive and all the details, but I just wanted to focus on the importance of the category of workers and the notion category of workers, because it's something that is woven into the entire directive and actually ties back to the job architecture. So as you know, the directive will need to be transposed in national legislation. It ties to everything from a total rewards perspective, base pay, variable pay, and employee benefits. And the category of workers should really carefully be identified to ensure that compliance with the EU PTD, because of the fact it's everywhere in the directive. And what you see at the left-hand side are the four main aspects where the notion category of workers is actually included. So the first one is in the transparency towards employees, where you need to, as an employer, will be actually obliged to provide information on the average pay levels by sex for the category of workers to which they belong. So again, here they're weaving in the category of workers notion. So you will need to be able to categorize your workers into a group that is representing work of equal value or equal work. And so that's towards transparency towards the employees. You will also need to report annually to government, labor unions, and employees on the gender pay gap figures. So also within each category of workers, not only on the entire company, but again, that notion category of workers comes back. So what is category of workers? And we will come back to that in a minute. As well, unexplained gender pay gaps. So first one is transparency. The second one is more the reporting requirement. The third one is what if you have issues in your gender pay gap and the measures included there. And there it also mentioned, if you have unexplained gender pay gaps of more than 5% in any category of workers, it will result in mandatory joint pay assessments with your labor unions or worker representatives, unless remediated within 6 months or unless you can actually explain it ultimately. So again, there in the measures, that 5% threshold, we're again not only looking at the full company, but we're also looking at that from a category of workers perspective. And so I think from a transparency reporting, but also a measures perspective, it's each time referring to the notion category of workers. And then the fourth element is actually referring to a definition category of workers. What is that category of workers? And the directive actually explains it as means workers performing equal work or work of equal value grouped in a non-arbitrary manner and based on non-discriminatory and objective gender-neutral criteria. And it needs to be done by the worker, and it is also in cooperation with the worker representatives. So what you actually read in this definition is, of course, there will need to be an objective system that allows you to categorize your workers, your employees into grouping on an objective, non-arbitrary way. And of course, you as an employer will be responsible to have such a system, and you will also need to be able to explain that to your labor unions and worker representatives. So I think that is really crucial to understand that concept that is woven into the EU Pay Transparency Directive. And ultimately, if we look at, for example, draft legislation currently being published in the Netherlands, was one of the first countries with clear draft legislation. We also feel that the labor unions and the worker representatives will take a crucial role in this one. So be aware, this will change actually the way we're looking at job architecture and grading systems. And then on the right-hand side, what we just wanted to mention, and we will come back to the details in a bit. Ultimately, it will be up to the employer to determine what is work of equal value. And there can be different approaches, but it needs to be objective, and you will need to be able to explain it to your worker representatives. And ultimately, you have two big approaches. You have a point-based system so you have the job architecture, which then results in a grading system, and that grading system is ultimately what defines can we group people in a work of equal value perspective. You have two big possibilities: an analytical point-based system or a qualitative leveling system, where point-based is much more adopted in the EU. The leveling system, the qualitative system, is more adopted in the US, for example. That being said, we also see both in EU and the US, and just to mention that. But for me, it's about you as an organization, as a company, being able to determine what is for us work of equal value and determine that in an objective way. But there are always three crucial points you cannot forget. First of all, the ease of explanation of the methodology to worker representatives and employees, because of the fact that you will need to report out on gender pay gaps per category of worker, but also will need to be transparent on the average pay levels towards employees. You will need to be able to explain, why did we categorize certain employees in a certain category? So that is crucial. It will also need to serve as a foundation, ultimately, both for the gender pay gap reporting as for the pay transparency measures towards employees. I would find it strange that you don't align those two groupings. I think you need to come to a sort of work of equal value grouping concept for both the pay gap reporting as well as the pay transparency measures towards employees. And what we actually see if we dive into the details with clients, they're sometimes a bit, conflicting with each other. And just going to frame that a bit, if you look at the gender pay gap reporting, the larger the group, the better it is from a consistency perspective, because a larger group means if there is a minority group, for example, female or male, in a larger group, it has less effect than if you would only have a group of 10, 15 people, and there is one female or one male in that group. That will, of course, create tension in reporting out on gender pay gaps. So the larger the group, typically the better. For the transparency measures towards your employees, it's typically the opposite. The smaller the group, the more easy it is to report out on average pay. So it will be a real balance between a gender pay gap reporting and the transparency towards employees. And you will need to strike the right balance in order to come to a definition. These are the category of workers. And we're not saying it needs to be one-on-one exactly the same as your grading system. You could group, you could deviate from that, but it needs to be objective and needs to be explained to the worker representatives. And ultimately, today in the EU Pay Transparency Directive, the objective elements, the non-arbitrary manner and the non-discriminatory and objective gender-neutral criteria described today in the EU Pay Transparency Directive are quite high level. We're looking at effort, skills, responsibility, education, working conditions, and then a catch-all phrase of additional criteria if relevant and justified. So you feel here we see that some countries are really going into an exercise to help also in specific countries companies, but don't expect a full-blown detailed guidance on how to categorize your workers in work of equal value. It is ultimately something you will need to shape yourself as a company based on your organizational context, your rewards context, and also how your labor unions or worker representatives are looking into this. And it's not because you currently do not have labor unions. I just want to mention that as well. It's not because you don't have labor unions that you will not be forced to sit together with worker representatives. It could be that you need to appoint that actually in view of this legislation if you don't have that yet. So,
Francis, we had a question to the audience actually also if they are able to create the category of workers. Do we take a question now or?
That's perfect. I think the perfect moment to
yeah. Maybe if we take the next poll then. So based on what Francis just went through, does your current job architecture then allow you to create the category of workers that represent the work of equal value? A couple of options there. So is there everything in place in job architecture currently?
It's going to be interesting to see.
Yes. Yeah. Response is coming in.
I really appreciate that people are responding on this one. So it's really good to see, and I think it's good to share across as well. But how does the view look like?
Yeah. So it seems that that most of the organizations have the job architecture allowing them to create the category of workers. But then only parts of my organization and it needs an update. So there are some changes to be done in the job architecture. So somewhat there, and then some responses there stating that needs to be looked at again the job architecture more carefully. Then,
So a bit of a scattered landscape, I assume, a bit depending on. I think this is typically what we also see. We have very mature companies from a job architecture perspective that are saying, look, we're actually in a good shape. But we also have some, and it was linking back to the job architecture survey. We still have a lot of companies who have a job architecture framework, but that is not 100% fit for purpose as is for the EU Pay Transparency Directive, or really needs a refresh. And we're not saying that you really need to do a full overhaul of your job architecture. That is not the case here. I think that is also not what a lot of companies will be doing, because setting up a job architecture is quite a massive project and program to implement, but it's carefully assessing where does it make sense. And we will come back to that in a minute as well. I think a pay gap analysis can also help you in identifying where do we need to capture something. And I see there's also a question on your view on how to act when you do not have enough employees in one equivalent group. And that's a good question. And you have actually a legal and a statistical point of view. From a statistical point of view, you could have a look at reshaping your group so you have sufficient people in there. From a legal perspective, it is also addressed in the EU Pay Transparency Directive. If there is actually a group that is not sufficiently big enough and cannot guarantee actually the privacy, for example, the EU Pay Transparency clearly says that, look, then the reporting will only happen towards the worker representatives, and they will be obliged to keep that for themselves in view of this piece of legislation. So it's not that there will not be a reporting obligation, but it will only be to the worker representatives and not publicly or to a broader employee population. So that is also clearly mentioned. And then how do you see the fact that official reporting should be done based on legal entity company? So should transparency towards employee also be done within legal entity? We, for example, have multiple legal entities in one country. Currently, as we speak, we expect that most countries will do that on a legal entity perspective. So probably also the transparency will be, from a compliancy perspective, be obliged from a legal entity perspective. 2 points I want to mention with that is, one, it's not because the legislation says you need to do it on a as a minimum basis on a legal entity level, that you cannot decide from an ambition perspective who will do it cross legal entities. Certainly, if your rewards framework is being set on a group level, and employees know from each other already, they talk to each other. So if you have multiple legal entities and they are actually working next to each other, I think it makes sense to create that not on a legal entity level, but broader. So the legislation is also not preventing you of putting the ambition a bit higher. A second element, when we are going into potential lawsuits, so not in the reporting, not in the transparency, but when we're going into the potential lawsuits or case law, then of course the transparency directive also clearly states that it is not just looking at your legal employer, but it's looking at the source that sets pay. So that does mean in a group structure that they will look at the group level, not just at the legal entity level. I just wanted to mention that as well. Okay. Giving the timing, let's quickly go to the next slide, because this is the EU Pay Transparency Directive now, approaching work of equal value through different methodologies. I think we just wanted to showcase a bit the spectrum we see in the market. So at the left-hand side, you have the very analytical point-based job evaluation systems, which some of you might indeed know, the well-known systems in the market. We at Deloitte also have our own point-based job evaluation system, the job evaluation system of Deloitte. And yeah, I think the big advantage of the analytical point-based system is that they are more detailed point-based and they are more easily accepted by worker representatives and unions. Why is that? Because there is a sort of analytical point-based system next to that, behind that. So that allows them to quite easily at that style, okay, how are points being granted and what is the reason behind that? Of course, the downside, it is very detailed and you need to go actually for each job through a point-based job evaluation exercise. At the right-hand side, we want to just showcase more the qualitative leveling system, which is quite known in the US, but also, for example, in the HRIS implementations such as Workday, SAP SuccessFactors, there you see you need to have a sort of leveling before you can actually upload all the employees into the system. And that is where it's more from a qualitative perspective looked at. I will come back to some examples, some use case examples in a bit, but there you're more grouping jobs based on a qualitative assessment, and not every job is then going through a point-based system, but it's more a qualitative leveling system, and it's more broad level. It's more easily manageable, certainly in companies that are changing quite a bit. So we're more working from a job family, job domain perspective. And it's more suitable indeed to easily adapt to the changes in organizations. And then, of course, you have a sort of hybrid system as well, which we quite often see now, certainly in view of the EU Pay Transparency Directive, where you have jobs that are grouped in a leveling, a predefined category of levels, but the level itself is also weighted based on a point-based job evaluation system. So you're not weighting actually a point-based evaluation is not done on a job level, but more on a levels basis, and just to frame that. So those are a bit the perspectives, and it depends a bit where you are today in your journey. Which job architecture do you have? Do you have strong labor unions, yes or no, to decide, okay, where do we want to put ourselves? And again, it's not that in principle today the EU Pay Transparency Directive will force you in the one or the other. Again, it's about explaining everything towards your worker representatives, employees, and coming to that grouping perspective. And just to make that a bit tangible, I think we have some use cases. Sam, if we go to the next slide, this is just a job architecture framework, how it all comes together. So if you look at job architecture, we see typically the shaping of job families, such as the executive level, job families and career tracks, such as the executive level, management, professional, technical support operations. And then we also have the grades. At the left-hand side, you see, for example, the grading structure, which are now ladders, but could be figures, could be another grading system you have. And ultimately, it's that grading system where you can decide on, is this analytical point-based, or do we do that on a qualitative leveling basis? And just want to highlight the difference between what is equal work and what is work of equal value. And again, that is, for me, a big difference what we will see in the EU versus what we will see in the US. In the US, they typically look at equal work, for example, job coding. to do benchmarking, but also to report out on certain metrics. While the EU Pay Transparency Directive is going broader. It's looking at the work of equal value. So ultimately, you're looking at your grading system. And I'm not saying that technical support operations cannot make a difference in the way you determine pay, because that's your job, family, or career track. But as such, you will need to look at what is work of equal value from an internal perspective. And how do we explain that? So that's a big difference. Equal work versus work of equal value, that concept goes a bit broader than just the equal work concept. And how to determine that, how to set those groupings, and that is a crucial one to consider. Okay. Voila. Let's dive into, I think, 3 examples of each of those systems, job leveling systems, and some client use cases. So this is a first example, and it's of course high level because we don't have the time to go into all of the details. But this is a qualitative leveling system of, for example, such a leveling guide, which we also talked about. So you see the professional leveling guide. So it's for the professional level, and there is actually a guide that will allow you, based on the criteria. For example, on this slide, you see 3 elements. You need to look at the scope of knowledge, work, and experience. We look at decision-making and impact, and we also look at leadership and autonomy. So these are now 3 criteria that are being assessed, and that are in principle much more than typically we are around 5. So here we showcase 3 examples. So these are the criteria, the competencies, knowledge and skills we assess. And then you see actually from a professional leveling guide perspective, you have P1 up to P6. This was for a very large multinational organization. I'm not going to say this will be the case for every organization. Could be that you're only limited to 2 or 3 levels, and you actually see it is described in a qualitative way. So that does mean it's looking at the position in your professional leveling guide that actually suits best that job. And so we're not going into a point-based system, but it's a qualitative assessment, and you typically have leveling guides to help you guide the way from a leveling perspective. And depending in which one the majority of the scoring is, for example, you have 2 times P3 and 1 time P4, then P3 will be prevalent, and actually this job will then also be slotted into a P3 professional level, just to give an example. So to make that a bit more tangible, these are the professional leveling guides, which of course we at Deloitte also support a lot of clients with to shape this together with them. So this is the first client use case. If we then go to the second one, that is where we are combining the qualitative leveling system with a point-based ranking. So you again see the professional leveling guide with the 3 examples that I mentioned. But you see, and let me immediately focus on the right-hand corner of the slide, bottom corner of the slide, where we actually say, okay, you have a professional track, P1, P2, P3, P4, P5, P6, but you also need to make sure that you can have a leveling guide, but you also need to make sure that across those tracks, you have a professional track and a managerial track, that you know, okay, what is work of equal value? And so we're not evaluating each job separately, but we're actually evaluating each level within a professional track or a managerial track. So we then also can know, look, if you look at the P5 of a professional track, that is more or less aligned with the manager track. And the same for P6, and that is more or less M2 from a managerial track. So that you also know, managerial track, they are still in the early days of their career, of their professional career in that specific level. But the professional track, if it's a very experienced someone, a job within a P6 of the professional track, that actually corresponds with someone in the early days of a manager track. So that it is also clear from an EU Pay Transparency Directive what is actually work of equal value. Okay, good. So this is a bit the hybrid way of looking at this. And this is then the third use case is really the point-based job evaluation system. So again, there are quite some systems on the market. We, of course, highlight here in a very objective way, but we're highlighting, of course, our own job evaluation system at Deloitte, just to mention that. And typically, they're all a bit build up in the same manner. The implementation is, of course, the most crucial one, how you implement it, but it always looks at different dimensions. For example, our job evaluation system looks at the organizational dimension, what is the role complexity and autonomy, the job holder dimension, what are the professional competencies and skills they need to have, and then also the environmental complexity in which a job is navigating. If it's only an in-house job, that's less complex, and it also needs to have external exposure and the context of the work that needs to be performed. So that is, for example, within the job evaluation system, the 3 criteria. And to make that tangible, maybe on the next slide, Samu, I just want to showcase each criteria has then actually a sort of point scale. And each point scale, you see actually the 3 point scales below that: role and delegation, professional competency, and environmental complexity. You will need to decide on role and autonomy depending on the sub-criteria that are below that. For example, in this case, it is a 7 on a scale between 1 to 17. And then based on that, you actually see that the professional competency, the gray zone, is already identified because they will have an effect. It's not that you can put role and delegation on 2 and professional competency on 17. That does not make any sense. So you start with role and delegation. You take, for example, a 7. You also see there the description, and not going into the details of the weighing exercise itself, but it's just to grasp the concept. You see professional competency, and then you also see environmental complexity needs to fall within 3 and 5, and here it's being used 7, 8, and 5 points on each dimension. And then ultimately that adds up to a more detailed point scoring of 200, for example, just as a conceptual insight. And then if we go to the next slide, so you're actually each job you're performing a job evaluation exercise. So from the 3 dimensions, you put a scoring on that, and then you actually see based on the point scales you provide to each job, they will actually be ranked. So we have between 100 and 200 points in the non-exempt jobs, the 200 and 300 the exempt jobs, and then of course a wider range between 300 and 500 for executive and senior executives, going from smaller companies to really big multinationals with a lot of countries in scope. So that is how you can then come to a sort of grading and leveling system with even sub-levels required next to that. And you then also see the differences in points also corresponds to, for example, 10 points is the smallest possible difference between 2 functions. 20 points is actually a difference that is considered as a promotion, and more than 30 points is tricky from a promotion perspective. That is an exceptional risky promotion. And so by having those logics as well, this helps you to build further down a bit your category of workers and what is representing work of equal value. Okay, and then I also see a question coming in. Quickly going to have a look. Do you assume blue collars need to compare to white collars? Normally they have different collective agreements. That's a good question. Typically, if you look at it, you need to look at it from work of equal value. But we also see that indeed blue collar workers are typically rewarded in a different system. They have also different kind of work compared to white collar workers. So in most cases, I would say those can be separated. But we have seen with certain clients, and when we go into a detailed analysis, that actually sometimes, and that could be through an M&A context, that blue collar and white collar workers are doing the same job or close to each other. And then it becomes more tricky because it's not that the EU Pay Transparency Directive is making a distinction from a blue collar or white collar perspective. They're looking at it from a work of equal value perspective. So if they're doing exactly the same job and it's work of equal value, it's a difficult one to explain. But of course, it needs to be looked at from a collective agreement. I understand that the legal local context. So we will need to see what countries will do with that. But by definition, it's not that it is a clear cut. White collars and blue collars do not need to be compared. It's something that needs to be looked at from a legal angle, but also from a context and organizational perspective. Okay. Good. And then if we go to the next slide, so we have actually, and this is just an example where the HR organogram, for example, is very flat. If you then look through the lens of the GES we're actually putting points, and you see that the HR controller is, for example, a bit higher than the recruitment assistant and the payroll assistant. So that gives you a bit that grade. And it's then actually up to you to also define how will we group everyone. It's not that if there is a difference, for example, 10 points or 20 points, that you need to create a different group for that. Could be that you say, no, we take those together. You see that. So that is an exercise where to put the boundaries. You now see the gray, white area, but where to put the boundaries, that is also where that balance between the reporting requirements and the EUPTD and the average pay transparency obligation towards employees need to be carefully assessed. It could be that it does make more sense if you look at the figures that you group certain grades together and report out in a more consistent way. But that is really depending on how your organization, your job architecture, but also your rewards framework is set in place. Okay, good. And then moving to the next slide, I'm also conscious of timing. A typical project approach, Deloitte perspective. I will not stay too long on this slide, but I just wanted to highlight on this slide. Look, this is typically what we want to, what we are doing from a typical project approach. So kickoff, the job architecture design in principle is one of the first things you need to do. You first need to look at your job families, career tracks, clustering exercises. So you will need to first have a look at which elements of the job architecture do we include? Do we go for career tracks or not? Do we need job families, job domains? What is the definition of each of those elements? That is crucial. And it's based on that job architecture that you then can actually decide, do we go for a job evaluation system, a point-based system, or do we go for a leveling approach, depending on your job architecture framework? And then in a phase 2, you actually are going to a job classification leveling system, depending on what you pick. So that is a bit where you need to look at the logic sequence of those steps. I'm not saying most of the companies have, of course, already a job architecture, and that's also what I wanted to highlight. In the fact, this is a very theoretical project timeline. Of course, if you have already a job architecture design, it does not make, or a job classification grading system, it does not always make sense to do a full overhaul and a full detailed reanalysis of, is this all okay? And I think we have on the next slide one example on how this could look. Yeah, what we now see quite often happening is some job architecture stress testing that is being asked towards us. What is that? That is just we actually upload the job architecture framework and also all the individual compensation and benefits elements in our pay equity platform. I'm not going to in all of the details today, but actually what we're doing is checking whether the job architecture holds from a compensation and benefits perspective. If you upload all the compensation, for example, base pay bonuses into the system, and you run it through a statistical regression analysis, you can actually discover whether your job architecture can explain sufficiently enough the reasons why pay decisions are being made. And that is that pay driver analysis. You see here an illustrative example where we actually see here the base pay variance can be explained 91% through the job architecture, which is a very solid figure. If you're above the 80%, that is what we actually want to aim for, 85%. And you actually see that each element, like job grade, job family, job domain, does explain something from the 91%. And then also by doing that, you can also look at in which cohorts, which groups of work of equal value do we still have some issues from a gender pay gap perspective, for example. And then we don't need to focus on the full job architecture, but we actually need to focus on the sections of our job architecture where it does really make a difference in view of the EU Pay Transparency Directive. So previous slide was more a theoretical, if you don't have a job architecture, these are the steps you need to go through. If you have a job architecture, my advice would always be start with running the figures, running the numbers. Do you have a gender pay gap? Yes or no? And then looking back at your job architecture framework. Of course, if you have a job architecture today. If not, you really need to start with the foundational elements. Okay, good. And then I think I hand over to you, Sami, again, if not mistaken, or to Janne for the...
Yeah, thanks, Francis. Absolutely brilliant and landing on the dot. So an hour goes by so very, very, very quickly. But first, I would like to thank you both, Samu and Francis. Wonderful presentation, a lot of material, a lot of facts, but also the audience, because you've been really actively participating and giving us a bit of feedback on where you stand at the moment. Right, so where do we land and how do we go forward from here? So first of all, as explained in the very beginning, we have a three-step approach. So we're now looking at this from the step number 1 perspective. So reviewing the critical architecture components. And basically, what are the questions that we like to have been answered through this step? And hopefully we covered all of this in a good level of detail. So first of all, do you have a consistent global methodology to job leveling? From there, is there a consistent approach to assigning jobs to grades? And then do you have a governance model in place for future changes in the jobs and leveling? So that is basically the starting point of defining the job architecture that allows really the categorization of your workforce through the lens of work of equal value, as Francis has been clearly kind of going through in this step. Very, very briefly, in the interest of time, there's a next step coming up. So that's about the conducting the equal pay analysis. So that is then much more about how do you really identify the visible pay inconsistencies? Do you have the explanations in place for the inconsistencies? What are the root causes behind those? And then do you really see genuine material factor that could be the differences accounting for the differences? So that's the kind of the next webinar focusing on the step 2. With that, anything that you would like to somehow add on the previous?
No, I think it covered nicely the next steps going forward, and don't hesitate to contact our team if you have any questions on the topics that we just covered today.
Exactly.
And I think we have also the QR code that you can scan to register to the next webinar that you just mentioned. So go ahead and scan that if you haven't yet assigned to register to our next webinar. Yeah.
Precisely. So I think with that, big thanks for the audience, big thanks for the presenters, and I hope to see everyone and even more of you in the next webinars. Right.
Yes. Thank you, everyone.
So with that, closing down. Thank you.